Guys, you might have noticed that I used the phrase the Dinesh D'Souza show instead of the Dinesh D'Souza podcast. It's kind of a minor change, but the reason for it is that Salem Media Corporation, which is the sponsor of this podcast, is now going to be also uploading it to their new television network that's called Salem TV Network. And so for that reason, it now doubles as a podcast and a show. It's going to be in prime time, 7 or 8 p.m. On Salem TV Network. So you'll actually be able to check it out there as well. Now, I want to talk about Elon Musk and Twitter because the Twitter board is now in full defense mode, but they're not just against Elon Musk. I mean, Elon Musk, like it or not, whether he knows it or not, is on the front line of the culture war at this point. I think he does know. I think he's actually ready for it. But what Twitter is trying to do is not just protect themselves from Musk, but they want to continue their practices of censorship. They are so committed to censorship. Let's think about it. This is a media corporation that is deeply wedded to the idea of censorship. That's why they're freaking out. And they're freaking out to such a point that they're even willing to cost themselves money, and a great deal of money, because Elon Musk is offering a pretty fancy price for Twitter. I mean, let's look at the Twitter value for a second. Twitter was at one point at $73 a share. Then when it became clear that Twitter was sort of chasing away half the country, censoring political opponents, essentially throwing its lot in with woke culture, people realized Twitter's audience is going to be stagnant. It's going to shrink. And so Twitter's share price dropped to the 40s, the mid 40s. Now, Elon Musk is offering to buy at $54.20 a share, which is a sizable premium above Twitter's current price. But the Twitter board is like, we don't want to have to start protecting free speech again. No. We're so dug into censorship. It's now our way of doing business. We don't care if we lose money. And so they've invoked something called a poison pill, kind of a way of diluting shares. And by giving people shares, current shareholder shares at a discounted price. And the idea is to block some outsider from being able to come in and take over the company. Twitter has now become habitual in its censorship. I don't think it's as bad as YouTube and Facebook. They are actually far worse. They are in the Xi Jinping category of censorship. Twitter is not as bad, but it's still pretty bad. Twitter recently, for example, suspended liberals of TikTok. Well, what's the libs of TikTok? What's their great offense? Their great offense is nothing more than quoting the left. They actually capture videos of leftists saying, really hateful and stupid things. And then libs of TikTok has been banned for, quote, hateful conduct, irony upon irony. The Babylon Bee, a satirical site, has been banned, and so many others. Parag Agarwal, the Indian dude who runs Twitter, has basically said Twitter doesn't care about the First Amendment. We're not, he says, bound by the First Amendment. And he says, in fact, content moderation is kind of what Twitter is all about. Quote, where our role is particularly emphasized is who can be heard. So that's what Twitter wants to do. They want to manipulate who can and cannot be heard. They have no trust in what can be called the free market of ideas. And now, Twitter, in doing all this and in trying to block Musk in this way, is facing considerable liability. It's facing a revolt from its own shareholders. Why? Because they stand to make a good chunk of money if they accept Elon Musk's offer, and they stand to lose money if they don't. I mean, Elon might get mad and sell his 9% share in Twitter, and that would most likely cause the price of Twitter to fall. So all of this is a way of saying that Twitter now has this insider board. By the way, most of the board members don't own a lot of Twitter. At one point, they owned a decent chunk because Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, was on the board. But now that he's basically left Twitter and he's left the board, Twitter now has all these guys on, some of them are just academics, PhDs. They own tiny fractions of Twitter. So the bottom line is they don't really have a big economic stake themselves. Their interests are not aligned with those of the shareholders, a point that, by the way, Elon Musk has himself made in of all things, a tweet. And we see as we look at the cultural landscape, all these people, The Washington Post, for example, is Max Boot. He goes, for democracy to survive, we need more content moderation. See, content moderation is the euphemism for censorship. These guys realize that from the time we were kids, we're all taught censorship is bad. We've all read George Orwell. We all know that socialist and totalitarian countries practice censorship. The Nazis practice censorship. So you don't want to be known as the guy who does censorship. So the polite word is content moderation, which is essentially a polite word for, well, censorship. MSNBC's Katie Tur basically says if Twitter protects free speech, this could have, quote, massive life and globe-altering consequences for just letting people run wild on the thing. In other words, letting people express their ideas is now running wild on Twitter. Extremely dangerous for the future of democracy and of the globe. And Robert Reich, who's the dwarf who used to be in the Clinton administration, he's an economist, but he pontificates on all kinds of subjects, usually speaking absolute rubbish. And his latest, his censorship is, quote, necessary to protect American democracy. So even though democracy relies on free speech, relies on exchanges of ideas, relies on presenting competing ideas before the American people, Reich is having none of it. For him, democracy means essentially shutting down the opposition, having a one-party state, having one set of opinions out there on social media. These people are essentially they're tyrants in tweed. They're authoritarians, in khakis. And it's scary that Twitter and all these leftist allies have now assembled to fight Elon Musk. Not because they're worried about a billionaire owning Twitter, but they're worried about having to do free speech.